Do not embarrass us by speaking to beggars. Abigail Carter lowered her eyes as her stepmother fastened the last silver clasp on her stepsister's cloak. The tiny kitchen smelled like burned oats, cold smoke, and the fresh bread cooling on the counter. 6 warm loaves. None of them were for her. Did you hear me? Mrs. Carter snapped. Yes, ma'am, Abigail whispered. Outside, the bells of Black Hollow rang across the valley. Harvest Festival, the biggest day of the year. The whole pack would gather in the town square beneath strings of lanterns and silver ribbons, while the wealthy showed off their fine clothes, their baskets of fruit, their tables full of roasted meat and honey cakes. Abigail had spent 3 days helping prepare for it. She had baked pies she would never taste, polished silver she would never touch, sewed the hem of her stepsister Clara's blue dress until her fingers ached. Now she stood in the corner of the kitchen wearing the same faded gray dress she had owned for 4 years. One sleeve had been patched twice. The hem brushed her ankles. Her shoes were too small. Clara swept past her in a swirl of perfume and velvet. Carry the baskets, she said without looking at her. And stay behind us. No one wants to see the servant girl. Abigail picked up the heavy baskets, one in each hand. Apples, bread, a bottle of cider wrapped in cloth. Her stomach twisted at the smell. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. Before leaving, she glanced once toward the counter. Mrs. Carter was arguing with Clara beside the door. Quietly, Abigail slipped half a piece of dark bread into the pocket of her apron. Small, dry, barely enough for a few bites. Still, it was all she had. The road to town wound through the pine forest for nearly a mile. Cold October winds slipped through the trees. Lanterns hung from the branches like tiny stars. Ahead, the roofs of Black Hollow glowed beneath the pale morning sky. The closer they came, the louder the festival became. Music drifted through the air. Laughter. Horses. The creak of wagons rolling over stone. Abigail followed several feet behind her family, careful to keep her head down. That was how she survived. Quiet. Small. Invisible. At the entrance to the town square, a crowd had gathered beside the gate. Someone laughed loudly. Another voice said, "Move him out of the way." Curiosity pulled Abigail's eyes upward. A man sat in the mud beside the gate, or what was left of a man. His coat was torn. His boots were worn through at the toes. A hood shadowed most of his face, though she could see dark stubble along his jaw and one gloved hand pressed against the ground. A basket of bruised apples lay overturned beside him. Someone must have knocked it from his arms. 2 boys no older than 15 stood nearby, laughing. One tossed a copper coin into the dirt. "There," he said. "Now you can buy yourself a bath." More laughter rippled through the crowd. The beggar did not move. He did not beg. He only sat there in the cold, silent and still, while people walked around him like he was part of the road. Abigail slowed. Something in her chest tightened. The wind lifted the edge of the man's hood for just a second. She caught a glimpse of his face. Pale skin, a sharp jaw, eyes the strange color of winter sky just before snow. Then Clara grabbed her arm hard enough to make her stumble. "Don't stare," she hissed. "He's nothing." Abigail looked back over her shoulder as her family swept into the square. The man had lowered his head again. Forgotten. Alone. Invisible. Just like her. The music grew louder as Abigail followed her family into the town square. Lanterns swayed overhead, silver and gold against the gray October sky. Children ran between the stalls with ribbons in their hair. Merchants called out the price of candied apples, fresh cider, carved wooden toys. Everywhere she looked, there was color. Velvet dresses, polished boots, tables piled high with roasted turkey, cinnamon rolls, honey-glazed ham. The smell wrapped around her like a cruel joke. Clara and her mother swept toward the center of the square where the wealthy families gathered near the fountain. Abigail stayed several steps behind, carrying the baskets until her arms burned. "Put them there," Mrs. Carter said sharply, pointing to an empty table near the other noble families. Abigail set the baskets down. Before she could step away, Clara shoved a folded napkin into her hands. "The cider is warm. Go get fresh ice from the market stall." Abigail nodded and turned quickly. That was always the safest answer. Not because she agreed, because arguing only made things worse. She crossed the square with the napkin clutched in her hands. Halfway there, laughter rose again near the gate. The same laughter, the same cruel sound. She looked up without meaning to. The beggar was still there, Someone had kicked his basket farther into the mud. Bruised apples lay scattered across the stones. A little girl nearly tripped over one, but her mother pulled her away before she could help. "Do not touch him," the woman whispered. "You do not know where he has been." Abigail slowed. The man had not moved. Wind pushed through the square, lifting his torn coat. For a second she saw that one sleeve was damp. Not from rain. A thin line of red marked the edge of his wrist where the rough fabric had rubbed his skin raw. Something twisted painfully inside her chest. She knew that feeling. The sting of pretending you were fine because nobody cared enough to ask. "Abigail." Clara's voice cracked through the square like a whip. "Move." Abigail flinched. Clara stood 20 feet away beside the fountain, surrounded by two girls in expensive dresses. They were watching her, waiting for her to embarrass herself. Slowly, Abigail turned toward the ice stall. She took 3 steps. Then she stopped. The bread in her pocket felt heavier than stone. She closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 breath. Then she turned back. The beggar looked up as she approached. His face was partly hidden beneath the hood, but those strange eyes found hers immediately. Pale, quiet, watching. Abigail knelt beside him before she could lose her nerve. Up close, he looked younger than she expected. Not old, just tired. There was dirt across his cheek, rain stains on his coat. One of his gloves had split at the seam. "You are hurt," she said softly. His gaze dropped to his wrist. "It is nothing." His voice surprised her. Deep, calm, too steady for a man sitting alone in the mud. "It still hurts," Abigail whispered. She pulled the clean napkin from her hand, then hesitated. Clara would notice. Mrs. Carter would be furious. For a moment fear rose in her throat. Then she looked at his wrist again. She tore a thin strip from the inside hem of her own sleeve instead. Carefully, she wrapped the cloth around his hand. The beggar went very still. Abigail could feel his eyes on her face. Not mocking, not pitying, just looking, really looking, as if no one had done that in a very long time. "There," she said. "It is not much." "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why help me?" Abigail looked down at the mud between them. Around them, people moved through the square without noticing. Laughter, music, horses. The whole world kept turning. "Because I know what it feels like," she said after a moment. "To be there. To have everyone look through you like you are not even real." Silence. Cold wind brushed a strand of hair across her cheek. Then Abigail reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the half piece of dark bread. It was small, dry around the edges. The only thing she had. "Here," she whispered. "You should eat." The beggar stared at the bread in her hand as though it was something precious. "What if you need it later?" he asked. Abigail gave the smallest smile. "Sad, tired, real. Then I will be hungry later." For one strange moment, the noise of the square seemed to disappear. The man looked at her like she had said something impossible. Then very slowly, he reached out and took the bread. The bread was rough beneath his fingers. Cheap, dry, barely enough for 2 bites. Yet the man held it carefully, as if no one had ever given him something so valuable. Abigail lowered her eyes, suddenly embarrassed. "I should go," she murmured. "My family is waiting." "Wait." His voice stopped her before she could stand. She looked back. He was watching her with that same strange expression. Quiet, intense, like he was trying to memorize her face. "What is your name?" For a second, she hesitated. Nobody important had ever asked before. "Abigail Carter." The corners of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. "Thank you, Abigail Carter." The way he said her name made something flutter inside her chest. She quickly stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. Then she hurried back across the square before she could think too much about it. Clara was waiting beside the fountain with her arms crossed. "Where have you been?" she snapped. "The ice is melting." Abigail handed her the fresh bucket without answering. Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes immediately. "What happened to your sleeve?" Abigail glanced down. The torn edge of fabric still hung loose near her wrist. "I caught it on the market stall." "You are hopeless," Clara muttered. "Could you not go one day without looking like a disaster?" The girls beside her laughed softly behind their gloves. Abigail lowered her head. That familiar heat crawled up her neck. Shame. She knew it well. Before anyone could say more, the sound of hooves rolled across the square. A long line of black carriages entered through the east road. Noble families from neighboring packs had arrived. The crowd shifted at once. Women straightened their dresses. Men lifted their chins. Everyone wanted to be seen. Mrs. Carter turned sharply toward Clara. Stand up straight. Smile. If the Hawthorne family is here, I want them to notice you. Clara smoothed her blue skirt and stepped closer to the center of the square. Nobody looked at Abigail. Nobody ever did. She slipped away from the fountain while her family was distracted. Something pulled her back toward the gate. Maybe guilt. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the memory of those pale eyes beneath the hood. The beggar was no longer sitting where she had left him. For one terrible second, she thought someone had forced him away. Then she spotted him standing beneath the shadow of an oak tree near the edge of the square. He was taller than she realized. Even beneath the torn coat, there was something unusual about the way he stood. Still, straight, as if the cold, the mud, the insults meant nothing. Abigail slowed. Across the square, people continued to pass him without a glance. A woman in a fur-lined cloak wrinkled her nose as she walked by. A priest looked directly at him, then turned away. Two men bumped his shoulder and kept going without apology. The beggar never spoke, never lowered his head. He only watched. Not the festival, the people, like he was searching for something. Then his eyes found Abigail again. Her breath caught. Even from 30 feet away, she felt it. The strange pull, as if some invisible thread stretched between them. She should have looked away. Instead, she walked toward him again. You should not still be standing out here, she said softly when she reached him. It is getting colder. I have been colder, he replied. His voice was low, almost thoughtful. Abigail looked down at his hand. The strip of cloth from her sleeve was still wrapped around his wrist. Seeing it, there did something unexpected to her heart. It made him seem less like a stranger. Did you eat the bread? She asked before she could stop herself. For the first time, she saw it clearly. The hint of a smile in his eyes. Every crumb. Something warm flickered inside her chest. Then a sharp laugh cut through the air behind her. There she is. Abigail froze. Clara stood only a few yards away with her friends. Mrs. Carter was beside her now. So was Thomas, Clara's older brother. Their faces were bright with the kind of excitement cruel people always had when they found someone weaker than themselves. Clara looked from Abigail to the beggar, then down to the torn strip of cloth around his hand. Understanding flashed across her face. You gave him your food? She said loudly. Several people nearby turned to look. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. No, she whispered. You pathetic little fool. Clara stepped closer, her voice rising so the entire row of market stalls could hear. We spend one day in public, and you decide to make friends with a filthy beggar? More laughter. More eyes turning toward them. Abigail wanted to disappear. She could already feel the square closing around her. But when she looked toward the man beside the tree, he was not looking at Clara. He was looking at her. Calm. Steady. Almost like he was waiting. The square fell strangely quiet around Abigail. Not silent. Never silent. The music still drifted from the fountain. Merchants still called from their stalls. Children still laughed somewhere near the cider stand. Yet all of it suddenly seemed far away beneath the sound of Clara's voice. Look at her, Clara said, smiling at the crowd gathering around them. Poor little Abigail thinks a beggar is worth more than her own family. Several women laughed softly. Thomas stepped closer, folding his arms across his chest. Maybe she found herself a match, he said. They certainly dress alike. More laughter. Abigail stared down at the stones beneath her feet. The old shame burned hotter now. She had spent years learning how to disappear, how to stay quiet, how to let cruel words pass through her without letting them break her. But today, everything felt different. Too many eyes. Too much noise. I told you not to speak to people like him, Mrs. Carter said coldly. She stepped forward, grabbed Abigail by the wrist, and pulled her toward the center of the square. Now everyone is staring. Abigail stumbled. The crowd parted around them. Faces turned. Curious. Amused. A circle began to form. Clara reached out suddenly and tugged at Abigail's torn sleeve. The weak seam ripped farther down her arm. Gasps and laughter rippled through the crowd. Look at this dress, Clara said loudly. She probably belongs in the mud beside him. Abigail quickly crossed one arm over the torn fabric. Her face burned. She wished the ground would open beneath her feet. Please, she whispered. Please stop. Stop. Clara tilted her head, pretending to think. You embarrassed us in front of everyone. Perhaps you should apologize. Thomas reached into his pocket and tossed 3 copper coins onto the stones in front of Abigail's shoes. They clattered loudly against the ground. There, he said with a grin. For your trouble. Since you like beggars so much. The crowd laughed again. One woman shook her head. Another covered her mouth behind a silk glove. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word. Abigail stared at the coins. 3 small pieces of copper. Enough to buy bread for 2 days. Enough to keep from going to sleep hungry. Yet she knew what they wanted. They wanted her to kneel. To crawl after the coins while everyone watched. The old Abigail would have done it. Quiet. Small. Invisible. She would have bent down because surviving mattered more than pride. Her fingers trembled at her sides. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Slow. Steady. The crowd shifted. Abigail looked up. The beggar had stepped out from beneath the oak tree. Mud still stained the hem of his coat. The torn strip from her sleeve was still wrapped around his hand. He walked through the circle of people without speaking. Strange. No one moved to stop him. Clara rolled her eyes. Oh, wonderful, she said. The stray came back. The man stopped beside Abigail. For one long moment, he said nothing. He only looked down at the copper coins by her feet. Then he looked at Clara, at Thomas, at the crowd around them. Something changed in the air. Abigail could not explain it. The wind seemed to still. Even the laughter faded. Beneath the torn hood, his face remained calm. Yet there was something in his eyes now she had not seen before. Not weakness. Not shame. Power. Quiet. Terrible. Hidden too long. Clara felt it too. Abigail saw her smile falter for the first time. What? Clara snapped, trying to laugh. Are you going to defend her? The man looked at Abigail instead. His gaze softened when it found her torn sleeve, the red marks on her wrist where Mrs. Carter had gripped too tightly. Then, very gently, he bent down and picked up one of the copper coins from the ground. He turned it over once between his fingers. Interesting, he said softly. His voice carried farther than it should have. Across the square. Through the crowd. You throw coins at the girl who gave away the last piece of bread she had. Nobody answered. A chill swept through the square, though the afternoon sun still hung above the rooftops. The beggar closed his hand around the coin. Then somewhere beyond the market stalls, a horn sounded. Low. Deep. Royal. Heads turned at once. Another horn answered. Then another. The crowd went still. From the far end of the square came the sound of horses, the heavy rhythm of hooves striking stone. Black banners appeared above the crowd. Silver wolves stitched across dark cloth. The royal guard. The first carriage rolled into the square beneath a banner of black velvet and silver thread. 4 enormous horses pulled it, their harnesses gleaming in the pale afternoon light. Behind it came a second carriage, then a third. Royal guards surrounded them in dark uniforms, each one carrying the crest of Black Hollow across his chest. A silver wolf beneath a full moon. The crowd immediately dropped into silence. Women lowered their eyes. Men stepped back from the center of the square. Mrs. Carter released Abigail's wrist so quickly it almost hurt more than before. Clara smoothed her hair with trembling fingers. Thomas straightened his jacket. The king, someone whispered. The Alpha King is here. Abigail looked toward the line of carriages, confused. Nobody had said the king would attend the harvest festival. He never came to events like this. People spoke about him in whispers. They said he ruled from the mountain palace beyond the forest. They said his gaze could stop a room cold. They said no one truly knew what kind of man he was. The royal guards moved through the square with perfect silence. Then all at once, every one of them stopped. A path opened through the center of the crowd, straight toward the beggar standing beside Abigail. Clara gave a nervous laugh. What are they doing? Nobody answered. The captain of the royal guard stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat lined with silver. His sword hung untouched at his side. Without speaking, he stopped in front of the beggar. Then he bowed. Not a polite nod. Not a slight bend of the head. He dropped to one knee in the middle of the square. Every guard behind him did the same. Gasps swept through the crowd. Mrs. Carter made a small sound in her throat. Clara went completely pale. Abigail could not move. She stared at the kneeling guards. Then at the man beside her. The beggar looked down at the captain for one quiet second. Then he reached up and slowly pulled back the hood from his face. The world seemed to stop. Dark hair fell away from his forehead. Beneath the dirt and shadow was the face Abigail had only glimpsed before. Sharp, pale, striking, not old, not weak, not forgotten. His eyes, the same impossible color as a winter sky, swept across the square. Calm, cold, certain. Abigail heard. Someone gasped behind her. King Lucian. The name spread through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. King Lucian Ashford, Alpha King of Black Hollow. The man every noble wanted to impress. The man every pack feared disappointing. The man she had given her last piece of bread. Clara stumbled backward. Thomas looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Mrs. Carter lowered herself to her knees so quickly that her skirts twisted beneath her. Around them, the entire square followed. One by one, hundreds of people, everyone except Abigail. She stood frozen in the center of the square, staring at him. At King Lucian. At the strip of cloth from her sleeve still wrapped around his hand. Slowly, his gaze moved through the crowd. Across the bowed heads. Across the frightened faces. Across Clara and Thomas and Mrs. Carter. Then it returned to Abigail. Something softened in his expression. Barely. For one brief moment, he did not look like a king. He looked like the man beneath the oak tree. The man who had asked her name like it mattered. Rise, King Lucian said at last. His voice was low, calm. It carried through the square without effort. Nobody moved until he spoke again. Except her. Abigail blinked. Confused. The crowd slowly stood around them. Everyone except Abigail. She was still standing because she had never knelt in the first place. Murmurs swept through the square. Clara stared at her with open disbelief. Then King Lucian stepped toward her. One step. Two. He stopped close enough that Abigail could see the faint scar near his jaw, the tiny silver threads hidden in his dark hair, the piece of bread still tucked into the pocket of his coat. Her breath caught. Without taking his eyes from hers, he removed the heavy black cloak from his shoulders and gently placed it around her torn dress. Warmth wrapped around her instantly. The rich fabric smelled like cedar, winter air, and something wild she could not name. You fed me when you believed I was nothing, he said softly. The entire square listened. You gave me your kindness when everyone else gave me silence. Clara made a strangled sound beside them. Your Majesty, she did not know who you were. King. Lucian turned his head slowly. The softness vanished from his face. That, he said quietly, is exactly why she is the only one here worthy of my kingdom. The square remained perfectly still. No music. No laughter. Even the horses seemed quieter now, their breath curling pale into the cold afternoon air. Abigail stood wrapped in the king's cloak, unable to move beneath the weight of every eye in Black Hollow fixed on her. Clara's face had gone white. Mrs. Carter stared at the ground as if she wished it would swallow her whole. Thomas looked back and forth between Abigail and the king with the helpless expression of a man who had suddenly realized he had made a terrible mistake. King Lucian turned away from them slowly. His gaze swept across the crowd. When I arrived this morning, he said, I came dressed as a man with nothing. Torn clothes, mud on my boots, no name, no title, no power that any of you could see. His voice was quiet. Somehow that made it worse. Nobody dared speak. I sat at your gate for 3 hours. I watched mothers pull their children away from me. Merchants laugh at me. Men throw coins into the dirt as if kindness could be bought for a few pieces of copper. His eyes moved through the crowd. People lowered their heads wherever he looked. You saw someone you believed had no worth. So you decided he was beneath you. A terrible silence followed. Abigail glanced at Clara. Her stepsister's hands were trembling now. Your Majesty, Mrs. Carter said suddenly, falling to her knees again. Please forgive us. We did not know. King Lucian looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. You did not. Mrs. Carter let out a shaky breath as though she thought she had been forgiven. Then the king continued. You did not know I was your king. Yet you knew he was hungry. You knew he was cold. You knew he was alone. His voice sharpened slightly. Not louder, just colder. And still, you looked away. Mrs. Carter's face crumpled. Clara stepped forward suddenly, desperation replacing the pride she had worn all day. Your Majesty, Abigail is only trying to make us look bad. She always does things like this. Abigail flinched. Even now. Even after. Everything. Clara's eyes snapped toward her. She wants attention. She wants people to pity her. Enough. The word cut through the square like winter wind. Clara went silent immediately. King Lucian stepped closer to Abigail until only a few inches remained between them. Then, in front of everyone, he held out his hand. Abigail stared at it. Large. Strong. The same hand she had wrapped with a torn piece of her sleeve. Her own fingers trembled as she placed her hand in his. Warmth shot through her the moment their skin touched. Not ordinary warmth. Something deeper. brighter. The breath caught in her throat. A strange pulse rushed through her chest, then down her arm. The world around her seemed to blur. For one impossible second, she saw flashes of things that did not belong to her. Snow falling across dark palace walls. A lonely room with no fire lit. A man standing at a window high above the kingdom with nobody beside him. Then it was gone. Abigail gasped softly. King Lucien froze. His fingers tightened around hers. The same shock flashed across his face. His eyes dropped to their joined hands. Around them, the air changed. Wind stirred through the square. The lanterns hanging above the market began to sway, though there had been no breeze only seconds before. Then someone in the crowd whispered, "Look." A thin silver mark had appeared on Abigail's wrist beneath the torn edge of her sleeve. It curled across her skin like moonlight painted in delicate lines. The same mark glowed faintly beneath the cuff of King Lucien's hand. Gasps spread through the crowd. "The moon bond," an old woman whispered. "It cannot be." Abigail stared at the mark in disbelief. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. King Lucien looked at her as if the rest of the world had disappeared. All the coldness was gone from his face now. All the distance. He looked stunned. Almost human. "You," he said quietly, as though he was speaking only to himself. After all this time, Abigail could barely breathe. "I do not understand." Neither did he. Not completely. Yet something inside him already knew. The poorest girl in the kingdom. The girl everyone ignored. The girl who had given away her last piece of bread. She was his fated mate. The silver mark on Abigail's wrist glowed brighter for one impossible moment. Then slowly, like moonlight sinking beneath water, it faded into her skin. The square erupted at once. Gasps. Whispers. Someone dropped a basket of apples. An old man near the fountain crossed himself beneath his breath. "It is real," a woman whispered. "The moon goddess chose her." Clara stumbled backward as though she had been struck. "No," she said sharply. "No. That is not possible." Her eyes darted wildly between Abigail and the king. "There has to be a mistake." Mrs. Carter grabbed Clara's arm. "Be quiet," she hissed, though fear had drained all the color from her own face. Thomas lowered his eyes. For the first time in his life, he looked ashamed. Abigail barely heard any of them. Her hand was still in King Lucien's. Warm, steady, real. She could feel the strange bond between them now. Not painful, not frightening. It felt like standing outside in winter, then suddenly stepping into firelight. Like being cold for so long you forgot what warmth was supposed to feel like. King Lucien looked at her as though he had spent years searching for something he had finally found. Then his expression changed. Slowly, the softness left his face. He turned back toward the crowd. "Captain," he said. The captain of the guard stepped forward immediately. "Your Majesty, I want every family in Black Hollow to remember what happened here today." His voice carried through the square like thunder beneath snow. "Not because I was insulted. I have endured worse." His eyes moved across the crowd. Because she was. Silence. Deep. Terrible. Abigail felt his fingers tighten slightly around hers. "For years," he continued, "you taught this girl that she was invisible. You looked at kindness and called it weakness. You looked at gentleness and called it worthless." Clara shook her head desperately. "We did not mean." "You meant exactly what you said," King Lucien replied. Clara went silent. The king stepped forward until he stood directly in front of her. She had always been beautiful. Everyone in town said so. Golden hair. Expensive dresses. A perfect smile. Yet standing before him now, she looked small. "You tore her dress," he said quietly. "You mocked her for feeding someone hungry. You threw coins at her feet because you believed she had no value." Clara's lower lip trembled. "I was angry." No, his eyes hardened. "You were cruel." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then King Lucien turned to Mrs. Carter. "From this day forward, the Carter estate will no longer control the eastern grain fields." Mrs. Carter stared at him in horror. "Your Majesty, the land will be given to the families in the lower district who lost their homes last winter." Murmurs swept through the crowd. Mrs. Carter swayed where she stood. The grain fields were the source of nearly all their money. King Lucien did not look away. "You had more than enough. Yet you chose not to share." Then he looked at Thomas. "As for you, you will spend the next 6 months working in the lower district beside the people you laughed at. Perhaps then you will learn the difference between power and character." Thomas lowered his head immediately. Yes, Your Majesty. Clara looked like she wanted to speak again. Then King Lucian stepped back toward Abigail. He wrapped the black cloak more carefully around her shoulders, hiding the tear in her dress from the crowd. The gesture was small, gentle, yet it felt more powerful than anything else that had happened that day. Clara saw it too. So did everyone. Abigail looked up at him, still overwhelmed, still trying to understand how the world had changed so quickly. This morning, she had been invisible, forgotten, the girl carrying baskets behind her family. Now the Alpha King stood beside her in the center of the square, his cloak around her shoulders, his hand in hers, his eyes fixed only on her. You are trembling, he said softly. I am afraid, Abigail whispered. His expression softened again. You do not have to be. Somewhere above them, the first snow of the season began to fall. Tiny white flakes drifted through the square, settling in Abigail's dark hair, against the black fabric of his cloak. The crowd watched in silence as King Lucian lifted her hand and pressed it gently against his chest, directly over his heart. Let them see you now, he said. Snow continued to fall across the square. Soft, quiet, beautiful. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They simply stared at Abigail standing beside the Alpha King with his cloak around her shoulders and his hand wrapped around hers. For the first time in her life, she could not disappear even if she wanted to. Your Majesty, the captain said carefully, stepping forward, the carriage is ready. King Lucian did not look away from Abigail. Good. The word was simple, certain, like the decision had already been made. Abigail blinked. Carriage. He finally looked down at her, and somehow his expression softened again. You cannot stay here. She glanced toward Mrs. Carter. Her stepmother stood near the fountain with Clara and Thomas, pale and silent beneath the falling snow. For one small, foolish second, Abigail thought perhaps they looked sorry. Then Clara lifted her chin. Jealousy still burned in her eyes. Not regret. Never regret. Abigail looked away. King Lucian noticed. He always seemed to notice. You do not owe them another moment, he said quietly. Something in his voice almost broke her. Nobody had ever said words like that to her before. Nobody had ever looked at her as though she mattered. Abigail swallowed hard. I have never been anywhere except Black Hollow. Then perhaps, he said softly, it is time you saw what the world looks like when people stop treating you like you are less than them. The captain opened the carriage door. Black wood, silver trim, thick blankets folded across the seat inside. Warm light glowed through the windows. It looked like something from a story she would have never believed belonged to her. Abigail hesitated. Her whole life was here. The little attic room, the cold kitchen, the empty mornings, the sound of Clara laughing downstairs while Abigail scrubbed floors above her head. She had spent so long surviving that she did not know how to leave. King Lucian stepped closer. Abigail. She looked up, snow caught in his dark hair. The silver threads near his temple gleamed beneath the lantern light. You gave me the only thing you had, he said. Do not be afraid to accept something in return. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Quickly, she looked down. I am sorry, she whispered. I do not know why I am crying. Yes, you do. His voice was so gentle it hurt. Because no one has ever chosen you before. The truth of it stole the breath from her lungs. Around them, the square had gone completely silent again. Even Clara looked away. Slowly, King Lucian lifted one hand. Very carefully, as though she might break, he brushed a snowflake from Abigail's hair. The touch was brief, barely there. Yet it sent that same warmth through her chest again, the strange, impossible feeling of the bond between them growing stronger. She looked up into his eyes and saw it there too. Loneliness, relief, something deeper than either of them knew how to name. Will you come with me, he asked. Not as a king giving an order, not as the most powerful man in the kingdom, just a man standing in the snow, asking a girl if she would trust him. Abigail looked at the carriage, then at the crowd. Then at the strip of cloth still tied around his hand beneath the cuff of his coat. The piece of her sleeve. The proof that before he was her king, he had simply been someone who was hungry and alone. Yes, she whispered. King Lucian smiled then. Really smiled. It changed his whole face. The coldness disappeared. The distance. For one second he looked younger. Lighter. Almost happy. A gasp ran through the crowd. Perhaps because nobody had ever seen their king smile before. He held out his hand once more. This time Abigail took it without fear. Together they crossed the square through the falling snow. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. They simply watched. The invisible girl from Black Hollow walked beside the Alpha King toward the waiting carriage, his black cloak wrapped around her shoulders, her hand in his. Just before she stepped inside, Abigail looked back one last time. The square looked smaller now, far away already. Then King Lucien reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out the piece of dark bread she had given him. Carefully, he broke it in half. He placed one piece in her hand. For the road, he said softly. The carriage ride to the mountain palace took nearly 2 hours. Abigail sat wrapped in the king's cloak, one hand curled tightly around the small piece of bread he had given her. Outside the window, snow covered the forest in silver. Pine trees passed like dark shadows beneath the moonlight. Inside the carriage, it was warm, too quiet. She had never ridden in a carriage before, never sat on velvet seats, or held a blanket softer than her old winter coat. Everything felt unreal. Across from her, King Lucien watched the road through the window. The lantern hanging above them painted soft gold across his face. Without the torn coat and mud, he looked every bit the king people whispered about. Powerful, beautiful, untouchable. Yet the strip of cloth from her sleeve was still tied around his hand. Somehow that mattered more. You have not said anything in 10 minutes, he said quietly. Abigail looked down at the bread in her hand. I am afraid if I speak, this will stop feeling real. He was silent for a moment. It feels unreal to me too. She looked up then. He was watching her now, not the road. I have searched this kingdom for years, he said softly. Not for Aluna. Not even for my mate. I searched for proof that there was still kindness left in my people. His gaze dropped briefly to the bread in her hand. I was beginning to think I would never find it. Abigail swallowed hard. You found it because you looked for it where no one else would. Something changed in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. As though she had somehow understood him in a way nobody ever had before. The carriage rolled through enormous iron gates just after sunset. Abigail stared through the window in wonder. The palace rose from the mountainside like something carved from moonlight and stone. Tall towers, silver windows, lanterns glowing along snowy paths. She had never seen anything so beautiful. Servants waited at the entrance beneath the grand staircase. They bowed the moment the carriage stopped. Abigail immediately stepped back. She almost expected someone to tell her she did not belong there, that they had made a mistake. Instead, King Lucien stepped out first, then turned and held out his hand for her. Just like before, Abigail placed her hand in his and let him help her down. The servants stared for only a second at the king's cloak around her shoulders and the moon mark faint beneath her wrist. Then every one of them bowed lower. Welcome home, my lady, an older woman said softly. Abigail froze. Home. Nobody had ever used that word for her before. The older woman smiled kindly. I am Mrs. Whitmore. I have served this palace for 30 years. Come. You must be freezing. Everything after that passed like a dream. Warm baths, clean clothes, a room larger than the entire attic where she had grown up. Firelight danced across polished floors. A tray of food waited beside the window. Fresh bread, soup, tea, more than Abigail had ever seen at one time. She stood in the middle of the room, unable to move. Then quietly, she began to cry. Not because she was sad, because for the first time in her life, someone had cared whether she was cold, whether she was hungry, whether she belonged. A soft knock sounded at the door. Abigail quickly wiped her eyes. Come in. The door opened. King Lucien stood there. He had changed into a dark coat embroidered with silver thread, yet he still looked at her the same way he had beneath the oak tree. Like he saw her, really saw her. In his hands, he carried a small silver tray. On it sat a loaf of warm bread. The smell filled the room instantly. Fresh, sweet, real. He crossed the room slowly and stopped in front of her. Then, without a word, he broke the loaf in half. He placed one piece in her hands, the same way she had done for him. Abigail looked down at it, then back at him. You remembered, she whispered. I will always remember, he said softly. His eyes held hers. You shared your last meal with a stranger when you had every reason to turn away. No one has ever done that for me. He reached up then, very gently, and brushed a tear from her cheek. No day of your life will ever begin with hunger again, Abigail. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall across the mountain palace. Inside, standing beneath the warm firelight with fresh bread in her hands and the Alpha King beside her, Abigail finally understood. She had not been invisible. She had only been waiting for the right person to see her.